Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. All right, so let's dive straight into this course. So when we, you, anybody, when we're having a discussion over a controversial topic, such as we are this year, it's beneficial to make sure that everyone is working from the same baseline definition. So for this video, we are going to be talking about defining terrorism. And whoop, missed by that much. All right, so as always, I'm going to have a slide sort of explaining the outline for the course. Obviously, there will be no key terms and hard words for this one because the key term is going to be terrorism. So let's make sure that we are all working from the same definition, same baseline. So that is, when someone brings up terms such as terrorism, we should have a common definition. Now, the problem with coming up with a definition for terrorism is, well, it's a bit like trying to nail Jello to a wall. If you've never tried it, hammer, 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 it just goes. If you have kids, fun experiment to do. But it really is trying to nail Jello to a wall. It's very hard to sort of pin down. To give you an idea of how hard it is to try to come up with a definition of terrorism, if you go and read the Hannah Mackie book, of which you're just reading chapter 16, but if you look at the introduction, Hannah Mackie notes that some scholars have counted over 100 different definitions of the term terrorism. Now you might be going, Mark, 100 definitions? What the heck, dude? Well, we'll sort of boil it down a little bit. So for the purposes of this course, when defining terrorism, this is the definition that we are going to be using. This is going to be the definition that we're going to be working with. Terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of violence against civilians to achieve a political purpose and produce a psychological effect, i.e. fear. Now, because if you remember back to our last video, if this was an identification term, you'd be going, okay, Mark, I need some sort of date. Well, you could simply put in the 19th and 20th centuries. So terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of violence against civilians to achieve a political purpose and produce a psychological effect, i.e. fear, in the 19th and 20th centuries. The use of violence or the threat of violence against civilians to achieve a political purpose and produce a psychological effect, i.e. fear, is the definition of terrorism that we're using in this course. Well, now we got this definition out of the way, we can sort of further break terrorism down into a number of different categorizations. First, we can break terrorism into state versus non-state terror. Now, state terror or state terrorism is the use of force or violence or the threat of violence against a civilian population. Examples of state terror could include the purges in 1930s Soviet Union that Stalin engaged in. As we will see later in the course, it could be the British use of military force in Ireland in the 1970s, or the French use of military force in Algeria in the 1950s and 60s. State terrorism could be the disappearances engaged by Augusto Pinochet, Pinochet, that happened in Chile in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, why would a state engage in terrorism? Well, state terror is designed to keep a population within the state submissive. and this can target the entire population. People would think, "Oh God, I do not want to be purged by Stalin, so I'm not going to do anything bad." Or it could target segments of the population. For example, you could start thinking, okay, I do not want the Chilean secret police to knock on my door, so I'm going to stop protesting against the government of Chile. An argument could and has been made that what Black Lives Matter protesters and African Americans overall are experiencing is a form of state terrorism. You have local, state, and federal police power, violence or the threat of violence, being used against this particular community, civilians, to put down these protests, to achieve a political purpose, and to produce a psychological effect. So local, state, and federal police power, that's this part right here, use of violence or the threat of violence, is being used against a particular community. African Americans, civilians, and they're being used to put down protests, to create a submissive population. In other words, to achieve a political purpose and produce a psychological effect, i.e. fear. So for example, we have, I love this picture. This is from Northern Ireland in the 1970s. We have a British paratrooper head-to-head against a Irish protester. Now, the form of terrorism that we're more used to seeing is non-state terror. This non-state terror is the use of force and violence against the population of a state by a group that's not affiliated with the state at all. Examples of non-state terror could include the Algerian National Front, who use terror against French citizens to try to get, going back to our definition, to try to achieve a political purpose, to get the French out of Algeria. Non-state terror could include individuals, so-called lone wolf terrorists. Examples would be Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh, the Atlantic Olympic bombing. And of course, I mean, we're most familiar with Al-Qaeda. Now, non-state terror is designed to provoke change within the state. So non-state terror is designed to provoke change within the state. This could include trying to gain sympathy for their cause. The FLQ kidnapping was designed to help gain sympathy for Quebecois liberation. Non-state terror could be designed to remove political leadership who they believe are in the way of more positive change. 1900s, 19 teens, we have anarchists assassinating leaders to try to provoke political change. We'll get to that in a second. Now, we have the division between state and non-state terror. But we could also break down terrorism based on its intended goals. It could be political terrorism, it could be social terrorism, and it could be religious terrorism. Now, political terrorism is the one that you're most likely familiar with. Political terrorism is designed to create political change and or achieve political goals. For example, many national liberation fronts in Algeria, Vietnam, as we're going to see the American Revolution, will use terrorism as a tactic to achieve their own political state out of a larger political state. So Algeria trying to get the French out of Algeria, so Algeria for Algerians. Vietnam, you have the Viet Cong, Viet Minh trying to get the French and then the Americans out so the Vietnamese can have their own political state. The American Revolution, the American rebels trying to get the British out so they could have their own political state. Now, when we talk, we're going to start talking about anarchists next week. Now, I'm going to have, as I said, the more terrorism based on race under this sort of larger umbrella. But it's important to note that groups like the KKK, groups like the Knights of the White Camellia are not anarchists. So I say this because social terrorism is another way we can sort of break down terrorism, the intended goal of social terrorism. And social terrorism is designed to keep particular groups within designated and designed social parameters. So to give you an example, this could include the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, 1930s, using violence up to and including lynching to try to limit the political and civil rights of African Americans. So groups like the KKK are trying to put African Americans back in their social box, so to speak. And so they use terrorism, again, trying to achieve a political purpose or a psychological effect on this group. Social terrorism can also include vigilantes, where groups or individuals deliver what's called extrajudicial violence. That is violence that takes place outside of the law to those perceived to step beyond acceptable social bounds. In other words, when people refer to Batman, let's say, as a terrorist, they're not exactly wrong. Batman, spoiler alert, he's Bruce Wayne, is taking the law into his own hands. Yes, he is doing so because the police, for whatever reason, are not able to go after these particular criminals. But he's using extrajudicial violence, that is violence occurring outside of the law against those who have broken the social contract, gone against the traditional bounds of society. And then we have religious terrorism. Now, religious terrorism is similar to social terrorism. In some cases, this violence is directed towards other sects, sects. Now, I stop here to sort of, I have to explain terminology. Sects, sects, is kind of a group within a group of a particular religion, let's say. Now I'm defining it here because when I say sex, sects, it sounds like sex, sex. So I had a student who misheard me because of my lisp and how I spoke. And so in a paper on dealing with terrorism with the against the Mormons, for example, he kept calling the Mormons a religious sex, sex. And obviously, the word processing program you use won't catch that because I mean it's a properly spelled word. So sects. So religious terrorism is similar to social terrorism. In some cases, the violence is directed towards other sects, sects, within the overarching religion, also known as dissenting religions. For example, in the 1830s, 1840s, Protestant Christians in the United States attacked Mormons, members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, in the Midwest, chasing them from Illinois and forcing them on a pilgrimage to the safety of what would become Utah, where they could freely practice their own religion. In other cases, religious terrorism is tied to this idea of millennialism. Millennialism is this idea that the end times are coming, and once the end times have arrived, we will get through it, and then you will have a millennia or 1,000 years of peace. And so the violence in this case is designed to try to hurry up the process. An example of this would be the 1995 sarin, SARIN, attack in the Tokyo subways. So, as we can see by this definition, terrorism is designed to provoke a reaction, either positive or negative, with a distinct goal in mind. So what this means is that terrorism is a tactic rather than a strategy. In other words, terrorism is a means to an end. The how do we achieve something rather than the end itself, rather than the goal. So the goal is the strategy. The tactic, terrorism, is how do we achieve this goal. So, especially in the 1980s, we have this sort of attempt to sort of redefine things. And we have this cliche developed that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. While it is a cliche, it does contain the kernel of truth in that perspective matters. Because remember, historians try to strive for objectivity, however imperfect that objectivity might be. To give you an historical example of this cliche, I present to you the American Revolution. Now, the dominant narrative of the American Revolution is you have this plucky group of colonists throwing off the yoke of the British government to form a, quote, more perfect union. Now, the numbers that historians traditionally come up with respect to the population and support during the American Revolution is this. You have roughly 33% revolutionaries. You have roughly 27% as loyalists, and roughly 40% who just want to be left alone. So what this means is that the revolutionaries were never more than 1/3 of the population at a time. So if you hear me talking about the American Revolution and the people fighting against the British, you will often hear me refer to them as rebels because they never had a majority of the population. So the question is then, how did 1/3 of the population kick out the British? Well, in part, it comes down to the fact that they terrorized the other 67%. Because in the cities, particularly those with significant loyalist populations. The favored method of terrorism against them was tarring and feathering them by groups such as the Sons of Liberty. So here we have an image, contemporaneous image. Obviously, it's been digitized. A contemporaneous image of a pamphlet coming back from the American Revolution. And here we have, this is obviously a pro-American, pro-colonist image. We have the members of the Sons of Liberty. In the background, we have a reference to the Boston Tea Party. They're dumping tea in the harbor. And this is happening under the Tree of Liberty. The Tree of Liberty, which has a noose on its limb. So this poor fellow was a British a loyalist. He had been beaten, swabbed with tar. That's the tar brush there, bucket of tar, all over his naked body. He had feathers dumped on him. And in this case, he is now being, well, really, I mean, the only kind of way to describe it is being waterboarded by tea. So tarring and feathering typically happened when a loyalist or someone who was perceived to be not revolutionary enough was literally grabbed off the street, beaten bloody, stripped naked, and then had hot tar poured all over his body before being showered with feathers. This poor man would then be paraded through the streets as an example to the rest of the urban population, or chased out of town as an example for others. In some cases, they would literally be ridden out of town on a rail, another cliche which comes from actual events. Literally, a piece of wood would be taken, put on the shoulders of several strong men. The person who'd be tarred and feathered would have his hands and legs bound. He would be put on face down on this log, on this rail. The rail would be picked up, and they would be marched out of town or ridden out on a rail. Again, beaten, naked, bouncing up and down as he's taken out of town. Not pleasant. To give you an example, in 2008, Paul Giamatti and others did a 7-part miniseries on John Adams. And here we have an example of a loyalist being tarred and feathered. It's a fairly accurate description of what would actually happen. And so by taking away support from the British, because I mean, honestly, who would openly support the British if they had a chance of being beaten or being tarred and feathered? So by taking away the support of the British, it forced the British to act more harshly against the population, which in turn took more support away from the British. Now, from the perspective of the Americans, both past and present, you have revolutionaries doing whatever they need to do to achieve their freedom. However, if we look back at our definition, we can make the argument that they were terrorist groups amongst the revolutionaries, because they used terrorism. So the Sons of Liberty, for example, are using terrorism, tar and feathering, making examples of people to achieve their goals. It's not much different than the Viet Minh going to a friendly Vietnamese village and choosing one man who is pro-French and killing him. It's the same use of violence as an example against a population to produce a psychological effect, to be afraid of them, to go, if I support the French, if I support the British, then this might happen to me. So stop sharing. As I said, this is going to be, we're basically going to be dipping our toes into the water this week. We have the introduction to the class with the syllabus in the first video, and in this video we are simply defining what we mean by terrorism. So next week we will be getting into the class proper. So go forth, slay dragons, and I will see you guys 1:30 p.m. on Monday, the 30th of August, first day of class. I'll sort of talk about the context of the course. So go forth, slay dragons, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. All right, have a good day. Bye.